Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my LPL Round 5 overview and analysis. Incredibly excited to get into this one. We're going to have one less team after this video is done left in the playoffs, and we'll also, by the end of this video, know our first representative from the LPL to officially qualify for 2023's MSI. Really excited. We're going to be going over, of course, upper bracket finals as well as the 4th place game here to see who ends up making it to the semifinals, the lower bracket finals, and I'm really excited to go over both of those series. Of course, if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. If you have not checked out my round 4 video, go ahead and check that out. It's going to be up in the iCard right now. The reason that that's important is I actually preview both of these series that we're going to be covering here at the end of that video. At the end there, I go over my advantages and disadvantages for each team and then my predictions at the end for how I think those series are going to go. So if you want some insight as to what I think going into this video, you can go ahead and check that one out. If you notice my voice is a little bit I don't know, torn, a little bit gone, a little bit lacking. That is because I was actually at LCS Finals this past weekend. That's why there was no video yesterday. There's hopefully going to be a double upload coming out today, but I've been having some pretty massive computer issues. I really thank you guys for, being patient with me and, letting these videos come out as much as possible, but trying to get these out as quickly as I can. And today it is LPL time, so excuse the voice, the hoarse voice, and hopefully you enjoy the analysis. Maybe if I'm not, even if I'm not as loud in this video, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it, of course, starting with our first series, which this time is actually going to be the lower bracket, the battle for 4th place, the battle for a chance at semifinals, if you will. It is a matchup between the number 5 seeded Bilibili Gaming and the number 6 seeded OMG. Not a lot of people saw both of these teams here. I think BLG is a little bit more understandable. This is a roster that I think a lot of people had pretty high going into the year, and, a lot of their potential wasn't coming out in the regular season, but they played really well in the playoffs. And then OMG is kind of the shock. Not a lot of people saw this as a top 4 team. I've been very high on them for a super long time, and I think they really have come into a lot of the potential that they showed, but this is not going to be an easy series for them, even if it's also not going to be an easy series for BLG. Both of these teams kind of are exciting in different ways. I think BLG is a very all-around good team. They have very good players. Elk, their bot laner was an MVP finalist for me. Yagao, a player who has been pretty sensational throughout his entire career as that big supportive mid laner. Players like Bin, who have had a really great playoff run. On's had a really good playoff run. June has had a really good playoff run. BLG's just kind of in really good form right now, and they barely lost to the number 1 seeded JDG in a very close series. And then OMG on the other side, a little bit more on the risky side in terms of how they like to play the game. They are definitely a team fight first kind of team. They're not necessarily the most dominant in the early game, but, you can't count them out in any game that they were in at all in the playoffs, and they really showed that, especially against top esports. That was really the series where they kind of proved that, but even against a team like LNG, and then even against EDG, where I think that series was a little bit closer than people expected it to be. Shanji and Cream in particular have really stepped up, but Abel's had a phenomenal playoff run. If Aki can get back to the form that he was on in the regular season, this is a team that can absolutely get to top 3. I think in my predictions, I ended up taking BLG 3-2. I think that was my prediction for the series. I thought it was going to be close, but I thought BLG was going to be better. It might have been a different score, but I definitely took BLG in my preview. But that was just my prediction. Of course, predictions are just a fancy way of giving a guess. There really is no way to get every prediction right every single time. So let's go ahead and see if I ended up getting this one right. We're going to be going game by game, talking about the strengths and the weaknesses. If you haven't watched this series before, I'm going to go kind of, in depth in each video or in each game, hopefully 5 to 6 minutes worth of analysis. And then at the end, we'll obviously talk about where these teams stand following the series. But let's go ahead and jump into game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was BLG. They are able to take the first game in this series. They look really good doing so. They drafted pretty interesting comp, much more of a team fight oriented comp, which is quite bold into a team like OMG that really does want to, kind of get to that stage of the game. But luckily for BLG, they're actually able to generate a nice early lead, and they never really let it go. They basically win every single fight across this series, or across this game, I should say. And, while Abel did make some of them interesting, Aphelios does do a lot of damage in the late game. There just was some really weird, micro decisions from OMG that I think held them back and allowed BLG to kind of smooth sail across game number 1, if you will. What ended up happening in the game? Well, first blood goes to BLG in this one, topside. In fact, there was a lot of action topside. June really wanted to make sure that that Kennen was in a good spot. They ended up diving the Malphite to get that first blood, which was really, really good. And then we have to move down to the bot side of the map because Dragon is spawning, and both teams clearly actually won it. You usually don't see massive fights over first Dragon, but we actually saw one in this game. Some nice fighting, I would say, for BLG around this. Elk ends up getting a pick right before the fight after some good laning, and then he's able to kind of secure BLG the Dragon. You know, obviously, Jun does a good job being able to smite it. It was a little bit contested at the time, but I think he did a pretty solid job of that. And then, you know, basically right after, Elk goes all in on trying to kill Abel in the bot lane. He comes ridiculously close, but doesn't end up getting it. And the reason Abel was pushed up so much is because both Aki and Cream were roaming down to the bot lane. They end up being taken down, but really, I think this just shows how aggressive and dominant Elk honestly is as a player. Zeri should not be able to aggress like this in the early game, even in the 2v2. It really should not be possible, even if the Rakan lands a really good knockup. And so, just good on Elk and on. They've been dominant in lane basically the entirety of this series, or of this playoffs, I should say, and that certainly didn't change in this series. Cream gets ganked mid lane. That's all right. It's just more gold for BLG. And then we eventually get to like 20-ish minutes into the game. It's not this gigantic lead for BLG, but they certainly have established themselves as the favorites in these fights. And then a massive play coming out from Yagao. He ends up teleporting right behind the entirety of OMG right into their jungle where they had no idea that there was a ward. He ends up being in this perfect flank position. He's able to flash Tibbers 3 members of the enemy team right as Baron is spawning, and they're able to wipe OMG. They're able to pick up Baron, and by that point, it's like a 6k gold lead. Abel, like I said before, was trying his best in some of these fights, but it was really going to be difficult to stop BLG at this point. They have a ridiculous team fight wombo, and honestly, OMG was way too aggro in the late game. It's kind of their specialty. They're going to make these crazy plays, but sometimes going in a little bit too much can be a problem. Aki over-aggressed on a lot of fights and ended up leaving a lot of space for Kennen flanks, for, you know, Tibbers coming in, not necessarily protecting the backline. There were a lot of problems I think OMG had towards the back half of this game, but you got to give a lot of credit to BLG for being able to close it out in the end. My player of the game for game number 1, no surprise, it's going to go to Yagao on this Annie. He made the pivotal play with that teleport flank, which was awesome, but just in general, I mean, those Tibber stuns were amazing. Adding Tibbers to fights, it's basically a 6v5. It's actually unreal how good Annie is right now when she's played at a high level. Sometimes we see this champion and this pick be relatively bad. Like, I know Fofo played it at a relatively low level in the series against OMG, but when we see it played at a high level, it's just very, very difficult to deal with. I mean, there's really not a lot of counterplay, and a player like Yagao, who can move around the map, is pretty much always going to be in the right spot because his macro is so good, is typically going to protect himself in team fights. He's not going to make stupid positioning errors. Like, you give him a champion that can, you know, just kind of walk up and do a ton of damage while also CCing the entire team. It's just a match made in heaven. It's something that I would not want to give to him for the rest of the series, but he definitely made the most of it in game number 1. I thought Jun was awesome as well, really making plays around the map. Really good objective control from him. He was willing to be aggressive, but he also knew that he didn't have to take a lot of these fights. Some of those knockups in the late game were really good as well to set Elk and On up, who were really good in team fights. You know, obviously you can see that from the score lines. I think Elk is just so mechanically talented. I think if you don't invest a lot as the enemy team into killing him, it's just gonna be very difficult to win. And then Bin with some nice Kennen flanks as well. The OMG team really wasn't all that prepared for Kennen. Obviously they had the Silas. They wanted to try and steal that Kennen ult for themselves, but it was just significantly more effective when BLG used it. Bin was much better than Cream in this game. And so pretty much everybody on BLG kind of stepping up, but Yagao was definitely the standout member in game number 1. And then for OMG on the other side, my dud of the game is going to go to Aki on the Vi. Just kind of a poor performance from him. He wasn't really able to do all that much in the early game against the Wukong, which is basically a death sentence as Vi. And then in the late game, like I was talking about before, it was just way too over-aggressive. He was often the one initiating a lot of these fights while the Kennen was on the flank when you need that peel. You need that ability to be able to get somebody off of your Aphelios. If the Kennen just full ults the Aphelios, he's just dead. There's really not a lot that you can do. And so, you know, while I think we've praised OMG's aggression at points throughout the split, this was not a good example of how it can end up being a positive. Shanji and Cream are very good engages here, especially with Cream's ability, I should say, to steal a lot of the ultimates, the Wukong ult, the Rakan ult, the Kennen ult. There were a lot of opportunities here for Cream to be able to, you know, kind of take advantage of maybe his champion a bit, and they kind of just didn't let him do that. Poor Abel was just on the backline getting absolutely destroyed, but unfortunate game for OMG. They got exposed for their biggest weakness that they have shown throughout the playoffs, which is their early game. They fell behind a little bit too early, and then one team fight went the way of BLG, and it was absolutely doomed for them. There really weren't a lot of opportunities for them to get back into the game. Hopefully you can kind of rebound that a bit, maybe be a little bit more consistent in the early part of the game, not give over so many advantages, and then hopefully get to that stage of the game where you have really been super good over the course of the last few weeks in the playoffs. And then for BLG, just keep this up. I mean, this was awesome. This was a really complete and clean game, quite frankly. Not a lot of negatives to give them if really there are any. I can't remember any massive misplays coming out on BLG, and so if Yagao is stepping up and playing really well, him and June have been on the same page over the last few weeks, which was a question mark going into the season. BLG is truly going to be a dominant team and is definitely going to be worthy of getting to top 3, but it's just one game. OMG certainly has the opportunity to get back into it, but this is a pretty big must-win for them. They don't want to have to be in a situation where they have to win 3 in a row against a team like BLG going down. OMG, they are able to take game 2 in what just might be the best game of the playoffs globally that we have seen in any region. I mean, what an absolute banger, a 50-minute classic coming out from both of these teams that OMG is just narrowly able to take a win in. Absolutely phenomenal stuff coming out from them. This game looked over. I mean, at 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes into the game, I mean, I would have turned it off if I wasn't doing these videos. I would have said, it's over. There's no way OMG can win this game, but the comeback was inevitable. Look at this comp. If you get them into a stage in the game where they can team fight, these players are good enough to be able to pull it off, and these champions are good enough to be able to pull it off. Just phenomenal stuff coming out from OMG, and honestly, I'm just incredibly impressed with what they were able to do here. Obviously, a lot had to go into them being able to pull out a win in this series, so let's go ahead and go over what ended up happening and what ended up getting them to the point where they were able to win. Well, you know, some action in the early game, again, coming out from both of these teams. Usually, again, we're not seeing a lot of first dragon fights, but today we are. Both games so far have been pretty active in the early game, and we definitely saw that again. Another first dragon fight. Yagao picks up first blood, and BLG looks pretty good, but it's not like this gigantic lead or anything. They try to get some more into the bot lane, but PPGod does a great job disengaging a Leona engage, and they're able to pick that up to kind of even the game out relatively well, but BLG gets some more small wins, you know, here or there, a couple of catches, a couple of objectives to be able to bring the game back into their favor. We're looking at like a 500, 1k gold lead, like nothing major, but they're definitely at least a little bit in control. And then you're looking at another dragon fight where BLG looks pretty good at first, but they just can't finish them off. And OMG does get back into the game because they're able to kind of survive a lot of these fights that happens in the bot river, that happens right around the Rift Herald pit as well for OMG. Like, there are a lot of engages where BLG, it's like, oh, okay, this looks completely doomed for OMG. And then everyone survives at very little health, and all of a sudden BLG starts going down. And, you know, it's back and forth and pretty close. Abel's positioning was certainly questionable in the early game, a lot of times where he's just getting picked off, but for the most part, BLG is just playing really well. They were able to get their first Baron at 20 minutes, and they're able to win the fight after that, but they're not able to close out because it's an awesome catch from OMG in the bot lane on some members that are overextending for BLG, so first Baron's a little bit of a wash, even though Yagao starts going back, and he solo kills Bin, and he gets a phenomenal engage at second Baron to keep them away from OMG. You know, OMG kind of initiates that, but a really good kind of turnaround from BLG, so now they have second Baron, but they go and try and end, but PPGod, with some phenomenal plays, a really good hook onto June to kind of, you know, dissuade a lot of the pressure, and so second Baron ends up not being all that important, so now we're heading to third Baron, and that's insane. Essentially, they go and trade that off. OMG is willing to give that up. BLG is on soul point, and Dragon is up, and so OMG ends up taking their third Dragon and giving over Baron instead, because they don't want to have to play into soul this game, which is such a bold move, but BLG, again, go for another ending fight with their third Baron, the third time they are looking to end this game, but OMG actually are able to win that fight. They survive the third Baron, they win the fight, and, you know, slowly but surely this gold lead has been chipped away. It was up at like 11, 12k at points in this game. It's chipped away back down to 1 or 2k at this point. OMG have done a really good job getting themselves back into it. It felt like BLG had it in control and it was over, but really good stuff coming out from OMG. BLG does end up getting soul in the dragon fight, but Abel and Elk make some phenomenal plays. This Aphelios ends up, you know, basically 3v1ing after the fight ends up going in favor of BLG, but Elk is the one who survives, and he ends up taking out almost everybody on OMG after that. Anyways, it's just both bot laners really expressing the skill that they are able to show off here. Unreal plays coming out from both of them, especially Elk, who was just unreal in this game and unreal in that particular fight, but eventually we get to Elder, and this is where the game closes out. It's going to be whoever wins the fight and whoever gets the dragon. and OMG is able to pick up the Elder Dragon. They're able to win the fight, and they're able to end the game down 1k gold. And it's just really, really, really good stuff coming out from OMG. Not giving up, being perseverant. This is what I want to see out of a scrappy, young team that, is kind of not supposed to be here. Even if they're faced with, some insurmountable, quote-unquote, odds that BLG were kind of giving them in this game, they were still able to overcome that. They weren't giving up. They were still fighting. They were still going for the plays that they felt gave them the best chance to win, and they were dissuading BLG from making the plays that they needed to win. And so really good stuff coming out from OMG. My player of the game has to go to PP God on this Thresh. I mean, an unreal Thresh game coming out from him. The broadcast gave it to Abel, which I totally get. He dominated the late game team fights. If you didn't have the Aphelios here, you quite simply weren't going to win the game, but I think PP God saved the game on multiple occasions by himself with that Thresh. The disengage tools that Thresh gives you, the ability to protect Abel, and even just the engage tools on your own path that, Hook, plus ult, plus Flay can kind of give you as a support. It's just really impressive. Obviously you got to be able to use it right, but PP God was really, really good in this game. There's just nothing negative I could say about him. I think a lot of people are going to overlook how important he has been to this team. In 2023, he joined a team of 4 players that were already together, and yes, they showed a lot of promise, but they weren't top 4. They're top 4 with PP God, and it's just another team that PP God has come on to and helped advance into that next level. But Abel was sensational towards the back half of this game. The positioning on the Aphelios was incredibly clutch, and specifically that fight around that final soul was just incredibly good coming out from OMG. And then you've also got to give a lot of credit to Shanji. Those Kennen ults were absolutely massive. If BLG didn't have exhaust up, it was absolutely doomed for OMG to, go in and just kind of get everybody on the backline to blow up. There really wasn't a lot that Zeri could do about the Kennen jumping on her into the backline and hitting her with ultimate. If he was able to lock her down, if he was able to deal that much damage, then it was a pretty easy cleanup, and that ended up being the case. Aki and Cream were good too, but I would definitely say Shanji, Abel, and PP God were the big reasons why this team was able to walk away with the win. As for BLG on the other side, it's just an unfortunate loss. You really needed to close this game out. We've seen a lot of games just not end. There are so many comeback tools in the game now with objective bounties and with how strong dragons are that even if you are able to generate like a strong gold lead, you're really not like secure in the game because there really are a lot of options for teams to be able to move their way out of, and this was just another really good example of that. My dud of the game is going to go to on the Leona just multiple times where he's caught out in the mid to late game. Some good engages this game, but a lot of bad ones as well. And honestly, even in the early game, the Leona wasn't all that good. There's a reason you don't see Zeri plus Engager all that much, and I know On's definitely more of an engage-oriented player. The guy doesn't like playing enchanters, and I don't blame him. When you're that aggressive, you should be on engagers, but this is just not a super synergistic bot lane, and Zeri definitely needed more peel on the backline, which he just did not have this game, and it definitely came back to bite them. Elk was playing out of his mind, but he couldn't do everything on his own, and it didn't feel like the rest of the team was really in a position to actually be able to back him up in the late game. But for BLG, if you end up losing this series, this is definitely going to be the one that got away. You absolutely needed to win this game. When you're up 10, 11, 12k gold in a game, it is pretty inexcusable for the enemy team to come back and be able to win that, but, it's your fault. You had to be able to close it out. You had multiple ways to do it, and you weren't able to. You just got to kind of put that behind you and, go into this new best of 3 that we're kind of getting now in game number 3 and just kind of shake it off. Keep your mental. And for OMG, you have to build on this. This is an incredibly big momentum grower. Not only were you losing the first game from being beaten in the early game, but you were kind of losing the second game from being destroyed in the early game. And for you to be able to come back, that should give you the kind of confidence you need. If you can get that early game on track, clearly you have shown that you are able to out team fight and out macro and out position your opposition in this series. And so just patching up the weaknesses should be able to give you some more success. But obviously game 3, very important. We're going to see somebody taking advantage in this series, but who is it going to be? Is it going to be BLG or is it going to be OMG? Well, the winner of game number 3 was BLG. They are able to take the 3rd game in this series and go up 2-1 against the upstarts in OMG. They actually were able to close out the gigantic lead they got in this one. And really, when you look at the series as a whole, this really should have been where the series ended. This should have been a 3-0. The sweep should have been completed here, but OMG stay alive by fighting their way back in game number 2, and BLG, for their credit, kept their mental. I think this is something that is really impressive. I talk about this a lot on the channel, but when a team gets, a really big lead and then throws it, it is very difficult to stay calm and composed and just go out there in the next game and continue to feel confidence in the game that you just played, because realistically, when you look back at that game, there are a lot of positives to take away for BLG in game number 2, and they knew that. They knew that there was a lot that they did, right? You don't accidentally develop an 11, 12k gold lead against a top 4 team in the LPL, and so there are a lot of things that they did right. They just needed to clean up some of the things that they didn't, and for them to be able to keep their mental, for them to be able to come back out here in game number 3 and look as good as they did, it's a good showing from them. Overall, this was actually very similar to game number 1. June with a really, really good gank on bot lane for first blood. The pathing was just really good overall this game from the Viego. He was basically everywhere he needed to be. One of June's better games in a while. OMG do get Herald, which I think is a pretty big contesting point for a lot of LPL teams in particular, but they get absolutely obliterated in the fight for it. So yes, they get Herald, and yes, they're going to get the gold from being able to let that crash into some plates, but at the end of the day, at best, it's probably going even, because you end up losing 3 kills, and BLG ends up generating a lot of gold in that anyways, and so not really a big positive there for OMG. They finally look like they're winning at Second Dragon. It finally looks like they do something. They're able to push BLG out of the pit, and it's like, oh, well, at least we're gonna get Dragon. We're gonna start getting on the board when it comes to objectives, but Yagao ends up stealing it, and it's like, oh, okay, never mind, I guess. I guess BLG is just going to get it anyways. It's just disaster after disaster after disaster for OMG. Second Herald fight is pretty disastrous for OMG. BLG end up making a really good macro call to sneak Baron at 20 minutes. It's just 2 of them in the Baron pit. It's just, I believe, June and Bin in the Baron pit. It might have been June and Elk. I don't actually remember. It's just those 2. Cream goes in because he realizes midway through that they're trying to take it, but he's not able to outsmite, Viego, who actually has smite while she doesn't, and then she ends up dying in the pit, so it's a Baron and a kill for BLG, and it's like bad thing after bad thing after bad thing for OMG. They finally go for a big dragon fight, but Bin just TPs into the base and ends the game. OMG do pretty well in the fight because they're up a man, but Bin can end the game. So, like, what are you going to do? It's the classic Dragon for Nexus trade on the side of BLG, and I think they're going to be happy to take that. Player of the game was so easily Yagao on the Vigar here. Really good from him. This is the second game in the series that he really has looked phenomenal in. It was great game 1 from him on the Annie, but game number 2 here, he was making so many plays across the map. He was instrumental in a lot of those Herald fights that ended up getting BLG the lead that they did. He did end up stealing that Dragon, which was pretty clutch, and then I think generally speaking, he was just a much more active presence than I think a lot of people were kind of expecting from him in the Vigar versus Akali matchup. That's not something where I would expect the Vigar to be the one moving around the map, but that's Yagao, man. He's just everywhere. He's got great macro sense, and he's willing to give up a lot of stuff in the mid lane to be able to secure objectives and kills for the rest of his team. So Yagao continuing to prove why everyone who said that he was washed and past his prime just was wrong, like was dumb and wrong and overreacting, like LPL fans tend to do. No offense, LPL fans. I love you guys to death, but man, the overreactions in the LPL fandom are insane. But, everybody else was also good this game. I think June was fantastic on the Viego. Not exactly the most dominant in the team fights, but his early game was so good, and his ability to kind of establish that lead for BLG was massive. And then I thought had some massive engages on the Rakan. But for the most part, this was Yagao and June, which I'm so happy to say, for considering where BLG were at in the regular season with these two, kind of being the weakness of the team, for them to be as good as they were in this playoff game, to kind of get them into top 3, that's really, really good. And then for OMG on the other side, Cream's going to get my dud of the game. He was just out-controlled by Yagao. When you're looking at these two mid laners, there's really no excuse for the Vigar to be the one that is out on the map, doing more things and being more active. The Akali needs to be able to start these skirmishes. She needs to be able to find these picks, and Cream just wasn't able to do that. He's just been worse in this series than someone like Yagao, and I think the difference in playstyle is definitely starting to show. Cream definitely more of a carry-oriented player. Yagao, someone who's definitely willing to give more stuff to his team and kind of be a little bit more of a secondary piece, and I think that's helped BLG out a lot. I think Cream is getting a little bit exposed in this series, not necessarily mechanically, but just in terms of what he's able to do macro-wise, and I think it's on display. I don't think anybody played particularly well, though. PP got at a pretty bad game on the Annie. I would have just put that mid lane and gone for something else. The Akali is just simply too risky this game, in my opinion, and it's not like Abel was really doing all that much. His positioning on Zeri at points in this game was really bad, but OMG, just kind of lost in the early game. Again, like I said, very similar to game number 1, and this is a trend. They have been destroyed in all 3 early games for BLG, against BLG, I should say, in this series. If they can't get that under control, they are simply not moving on to that top 3 spot. But for BLG, if they're able to win this next game, they are moving on. It is do or die for OMG, and it is series point for BLG. So a very big game 4 for both of these teams, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was OMG, they are able to win Game 4. They're able to keep their playoff hopes alive here in 2023. And they're able to push us to a game number 5. Incredibly excited. This series has been very fun, very back and forth, and it's really good to see this go to a game 5. But man, this was almost a game 2 in the wrong kind of way for OMG. They had a huge lead in the early game for the first time this entire series. Games 1, 2, and 3 in the early game were all dominated and controlled by Bilibili. But in game number 4, OMG put on their early game pants, and they actually went out and did a lot of work in the early game. They actually get first blood into the top lane onto Bin. Bin comes very close to being able to outplay that, but the result is all that matters. Aki does a really good job in that avenue of just being able to create pressure. And then a really good fight around first Drake. Again, another fight around first Drake. We're not seeing teams be super aggressive in trying to contest the first Drake in a lot of other, I guess, series so far, not only in the LPL, but in any other region. OMG and BLG both prioritize it incredibly highly, though, and so very, very fun to see that. But OMG is able to get the Drake. They're able to win the fight, and honestly, a lot of positives. Even the plays that BLG are trying to make don't end up going their way, like, in full. They go for a bot dive with the Wukong because the Zeri is susceptible to that, and they are able to pick up a kill. But Shanji makes a really good play and actually roams down bot while this is happening and is able to trade one back. And so really good stuff coming out from OMG in that vein. You know, a lot of the positives that BLG is able to generate, OMG is able to kind of, you know, equalize and if not, just take a lot more. They're able to generate a pretty solid lead in the early to mid game. And the mid game is really where Aki takes over on this Lee Sin. Great fight for OMG around second dragon, around third dragon as well. And the Lee Sin is incredibly integral in what they're trying to do. The engages, the repositioning, all of it's just really good coming out from him, and really there's not a lot of ways to counter that. Now, it really isn't the most calm game of all time. I know up until this point in this recap, I've really only talked about OMG in this game, but BLG does start to make some really good plays towards the back half of the mid game, right at the beginning of the late game, and most of them are coming through Elk on this Aphelios, who is just incredibly strong. We've talked about this matchup a lot over the course of this series because they're 80 carries that we've really seen across this series so far, but there's a reason for it. It's because both of them can have the ability to take over the game by themselves in the late game, and Elk is definitely good enough as a player to be able to make that interesting. He goes insanely nuts after a Gal engage bot lane. Herald was dropped, and, you know, they went for a pick onto Bin, which they ended up getting, but they overstayed, and Elk ends up being able to deal a ridiculous amount of damage, gets a lot of gold on the Aphelios, and all of a sudden the game becomes a lot less easy for OMG to close out. OMG does end up getting a really nice fight at Baron. They're able to kind of just out-mechanic a lot of what BLG is doing. They take it relatively slow, and they're able to pick up 3 kills on their own, but they need to reset because of the way the fight ended up going, and so by the time we get back to Baron, BLG is there as well, and they're actually able to get it. BLG does a really good job kind of destroying the fight and being able to outposition an OMG team that really wasn't prepared to have to deal with BLG after they already won the first fight. Now, we see one of the most unreal, kind of almost like I almost threw my monitor out the window kind of plays with Abel on this Zeri. He came so close to, I mean, legitimately 1v5ing. There was a really bad fight for OMG around, what was it, 4th Dragon, I believe? 5th Dragon? One of the two. In the bot lane, there was an unbelievable fight for BLG that they played exceptional, and then Abel and PP God were the only 2 left alive. Zeri dashes over the wall and looks like she's legit gonna 1v5. Like, looks like she is just going to auto-queue everybody to death on the side of BLG by herself, but really good engage from June to be able to stop that from happening. She still picks up, I think, 2 or 3 on her own. That really delays a lot of the progress BLG can make, but that was the first, like, oh my god, Zeri moment that I've had in, like, not a while, because you do see them very often, but, you know, ADCs are strong in general. That was one, like, Zeri specific, like, oh my god, I almost threw my monitor out the window kind of moment. But OMG do win a big fight in the mid lane that seemed innocuous, but it went so in favor of OMG that they just were able to end the game off of it. And, you know, all that comeback potential for BLG that equalize, you know, for them to be able to equalize the gold, for them to be able to get Baron and win a lot of these fights and really make this nice comeback, it all was for naught because of that fight towards the back half of the game. But OMG, for the most part, looked good in this one. I know people aren't going to be happy about, you know, what they ended up doing and how they weren't able to close out the game, but at the very least, they were able to end it and they were able to win it. You know, it wasn't exactly the cleanest, but a win is a win, and staying alive is staying alive. My player of the game is going to go to Aki in the jungle. They were not going to be able to generate as big of a lead in the early game if he didn't play nearly as good on this Lee Sin. Not necessarily a pick that I think he's been all that good at, especially compared to, like, the Lee Sin Masters that we see in the LPL and the LCK. That champion can just be played played at a ridiculously high level. Not to say he's bad at it by any means, it's just not one of the picks that I most associate with Aki, but man, his early game and his mid game in particular were phenomenal here on the Lee Sin, just creating pressure in basically every lane, and the team fighting that was probably the part that I thought Aki was the most impressive at. Abel obviously was disgusting towards the back half of this game. Zeri as a champion is incredibly unbelievable to watch, but you know, you got to give Abel credit as well. As a mechanical player, he's right up there with almost anybody in the world. Now, I've seen a lot of conversation around, like, when are we going to start talking about Abel as one of the best ADCs in the world? And while I think mechanics-wise he's up there, decision-making, he's certainly not. He quite frankly, regularly makes bad decisions and puts himself in bad positions. A lot of times he's able to get out of it because he's a really, really talented player, but for me, it's hard to call him one of the best ADCs in the world when, you know, at least once per game, he's going to be doing something that is just completely inexcusable, and that's just a trend, I would say, for Abel, but in this game, he was still really good. PP God was good on the Lulu, and then the soul layers were good too. I thought Shanji did a really good job in the early game of being able to create pressure, and honestly, you know, BLG invested so much into killing the Cassante late game, it allowed the Zeri to do basically whatever she wanted. So credit to Shanji in that vein, but OMG, even if it wasn't the cleanest end, were able to close out the game. As for BLG on the other side, not the best game in the world. Losing early game as hard as you did was not good, especially in a series where you've controlled the early game, but it was bound to happen, you know, once in this series for you. It's going to be very difficult to be as good as they were in the early game in every single game across this series, but, you know, there were some things I would have liked to see improved. I think Jun just got out-jungled in this game, quite frankly. He's going to be my dud of the game on the Wukong, especially in the early to mid-game. He just had zero pressure. Now, some of his teamfight engages towards the back half were good, but I would argue that his engages towards the back half of the game were also really bad. He was going on the Cassante a lot of times, hitting him with the knockup, and not really creating space for Elk to be able to, you know, actually deal damage. You know, you wanted to be able to get on that Zeri, and it felt like Wukong was really difficult, you know, not difficult, I should say, really poor at diving the backline. And Yagao and On were in a similar boat. I didn't feel like anybody on BLG had a particularly great game outside of Elk, who just continues to be the absolute diamond in the rough for BLG. He is, you know, what a lot of people say we want Abel to be. I think Abel, not to be, you know, BM here, but I think Abel one day could hope to be Elk, right? Elk is a top 3 to 5 AD carry in the world, and I think he's proven that over the course of the playoffs. He's been really good, and even when the team around him isn't exactly performing well, even if he doesn't have the best setup in the world, he still can control a lot of these fights. Unfortunately, OMG was just a little bit stronger towards the back half, and they weren't able to make it work. But now we're going to a game number 5. It's win or go home for both of these teams. This is an elimination series, and so one of these teams is going to be out after this next game. Is it going to be BLG or is it going to be OMG? Well, the winner of game number 5 was BLG. They are able to pick up the win here in Game 5, and they're able to secure their spot in the top 3 of the LPL, only one series away from finals. Really good stuff coming out from BLG. Really impressive stuff coming out from their bot lane in particular in this game, but really it never should have been. We'll go ahead and get to that when we talk about you know, what ended up happening in this game, but congratulations to this team. This is now officially the best finish that BLG has ever had in the history of the LPL. This has felt like a cursed organization for so long. It felt like no matter how much talent they would bring in, that talent would inevitably underperform on the organization and then go to a different team and actually live up to its potential. But finally, it felt like these players really got together, and clearly they have been able to make it work at an incredibly high level. BLG is moving on, and I'm proud of them. Let's go ahead and talk about how they got there, though. Actually, it was a pretty good early game from OMG. On goes for an aggressive play on his signature Blitzcrank, the pick that I think we all associate the most with him at this point. Very cool that he brought it out here in game number 5, but you know, he goes for a big pick in the early game. He's able to land the hook, but a really good turn come out from OMG. Aki's in the right place at the right time, and they're able to chase down they're able to chase down Elk, and they're able to pick up 2 kills for first blood, and all of a sudden, this bot lane matchup is super in favor of OMG. With gold on the Aphelios, a double kill early onto him, it felt like, okay, well, now Zeri's going to be put super far behind. She's going to have to do something unbelievable, or OMG's going to have to make a major mistake in order to give it back, and unfortunately, the latter happened to be true. OMG makes a massive mistake in the mid-game. They're just way too far up. The Lulu in particular is way too far up. She gets hooked by the Blitzcrank. She ends up going down, and then another kill for Elk onto Abel in that same exchange. Lulu goes down with Flash and with Ultimate still up. She doesn't use either of them, and it's absolutely disastrous. If they're able to survive that, not even just turn it, but survive that, they still have a pretty massive lead, even if they do have to give over a bit of an advantage. But losing that and giving those kills kills over to Elk, that was game losing, and that ended up being the turning point of the game. On, Bin, June, all of them play ridiculously crazy aggressive towards the mid game. They are able to dive. Abel and PP got under tower. Hell, they'll even go to tier 2 to be able to pick up some of the kills, and there's really not a lot OMG are going to be able to do about it. June gets another fantastic engage around Baron now at around 20 minutes. We're looking in the enemy jungle. He goes in and gets some kills. We kind of reset a bit, for this Baron fight, but Elk ends up getting a triple kill at the Baron fight with June securing it, and, you end up getting a delayed ace on the side of OMG, or on the side of BLG, I should say, which is just really, really good stuff coming out from them, and eventually, On does hit a Death Bush hook right on top of the Maokai, after some posturing, after some really good play from BLG to be able to close it out. Just a really dominant game from BLG, the shortest game of the entire series here in game number 5, but they earned it. I mean, there is no debate. You could have called this a 4-1 for BLG if you really wanted to say that because of how game 2 went, but, at the end of the day, they were able to make it good, and they were able to come out on top. On's gonna get my player of the game. It was hook after hook after hook coming out on the Blitzcrank, proving again why teams have to ban out this champion against BLG. I understand that there are a lot of things you quote-unquote have to ban out against BLG. Kindred's definitely one of them. It feels like Kennen has turned into another, but Blitzcrank has to be on that list at this point. On is simply too good at that champion. It's become his signature, and he's really proved it. It doesn't matter who he's playing it into. He's going to be able to make a good use out of it no matter what. And then Yagao had another phenomenal game on the Annie here. Some really good flash stuns, and just generally speaking was awesome this series the whole time. He's actually going to be my player of the series here in the round 5 matchup. It was just good stuff coming out from him. He has improved so much from what his regular season performance was, and I thought he was really good at the back half of the regular season, but he's even taken that to a new level. This very much does unironically feel like JDG Yagao here on BLG, and that helps them out a ton. But of course, Elk is going to get a lot of notice for this game. He was sensational this entire series. He's the best player on BLG, and he consistently proves it. When he's able to generate a lead, it is just GG on the other side. There's nothing you can do to stop him. He is just too good at the game of League of Legends. But overall, really good stuff from BLG. Unfortunate stuff for OMG. Your season comes to an end here. It's a frustrating way to end, but at the end of the day, you have to look at 2023 Spring as a massive, massive positive for the OMG organization. For them to be able to come out and finish 4th in the LPL, this split it's amazing. This is the best that they have done ever since the golden days of OMG back in 2012, 2013, 2014. This is the best team that this organization has had in a decade, and it is a really, really good thing to see them be able to do it with homegrown talent, players that they picked up at a young age, with a lot of potential, unproven, and they're able to put it together and make it work. Shanji, Cream, Abel, Aki, the core that has been there for OMG was able to make top 4, and hopefully it's only growth in the future, even if they weren't able to get it done in this series. PP God is unfortunately going to get my dud of the game. Abel wasn't particularly good either, and Aki was getting hooked a lot in the late game, but, even if this wasn't their series, for them to be able to take down, major teams, not just okay teams, but teams like Top Esports, teams like LNG Esports, for them to be able to beat those teams and make their way here, it's just impressive stuff, and even hold their own, relatively speaking, against a team like EDG, which a lot of people see as an MSI favorite. So just good stuff. I mean, great stuff, honestly, if we're talking about OMG. Hopefully the upward trajectory continues. This team is a lot of fun to watch, and, I'm really hoping that they get to go to an international event in 2023. But for BLG, they're going to be moving on. Like I said, Yagao is my player of the series, but if they continue to play like this, there is no easy series left for any team in the upper bracket, no matter who ends up moving on in the series that we're going to talk about next. Nobody wants to lose that one, not because you're not guaranteed finals, but because you'd have to go up against BLG, and that is a tall task for any team right now with how they are playing. I would not be surprised if this team went out and not only won their semifinals matchup, but even won finals. That's how well this team is playing at the current moment, and truthfully, they are going to be a threat for either of the teams in the upper bracket. But now that we've finished up our coverage of the lower bracket series, it's time to move on to our upper bracket finals. It's the top 2 teams in the LPL in the regular season, the 2 teams to win their matchups in round number 4. It's the number 1 seeded JD Gaming taking on the number 2 seeded Edward Gaming for the opportunity to play in the LPL finals, as well as a one-way ticket to MSI. Very, very big series here between these 2 teams. One of them is going to clinch a very important spot, and that is top 2 in the LPL. The other will have to go down into the lower bracket to take on BLG, who we just saw take down OMG in a very close 5-game set. So this is going to be a big one. Very interesting matchup between these two teams. JDG, in their best form, beats anybody in the world, maybe even T1. They're really the only other team that I think can compete with JDG at the level that they are at when they are playing at their best. We've seen 18-minute wins. We've seen 19-minute wins. We've seen 20-minute wins from this JDG team consistently throughout the season when they are playing unreal. The talent is there. It's just the consistency that comes out with, a bunch of really talented, high-resource players playing together. Sometimes, you're not going to be able to generate that ridiculous lead in the early and mid-game, and you're going to have to be a little bit more thoughtful with your macro, and that's where JDG can struggle a bit. But for EDG, that's where they excel. If they can get to the mid to late game, they are an incredibly coherent force as a group. Leave, in particular, has really taken over as a great hyper carry in the late game. Jeje, Fofo, Ale, Mako, all pro caliber players. Every single player on EDG made an all-pro team for me, with the exception of Leave, who won my rookie of the split. And so, a lot of positives coming out from EDG, but JDG is one of those teams where it just takes one day for them to click and they will get by. And contrary to popular opinion, I actually picked JD Gaming in this series. I think pretty much everybody else picked EDG. You can go check that out, if you want a more in-depth detail as to what I think about JDG is kind of giving them an advantage in this series. You can check that out in that round 4 video linked in the iCard, but I just think that it's really hard for me to count out JDG. I know they weren't perfect against BLG, but we've just seen how good of a team they actually are, and I think the talent on this team is just really hard to root against, even when EDG is as good as they have been. But it's going to be an interesting series. I think I said JDG in 5, and so that was my my prediction, but it could go either way. I could see EDG just dominating this series. They've looked like the more coherent team as of recent, but it's going to be interesting nonetheless. So let's go ahead and go game by game, of course, starting with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was JD Gaming. They do jump out to a 1-0 series lead here in game number 1, and that's huge for them. Confidence and momentum have been massive for them. Once they're able to jump out to a lead, they very rarely relinquish it in the same kind of way. They weren't able to do that in the BLG series. BLG ended up taking the advantage in that series, but JDG does a great job being able to kind of reverse their fortunes in this one, be able to create some early pressure, maybe not as much as EDG did, but, relatively speaking, have a foothold on the map and be able to capitalize on a lot of mistakes that EDG ended up making to be able to close out the game. So what ended up happening moment by moment? Well, First Blood does go over to Fofo in the mid lane, and man, this might be the single easiest First Blood I've ever seen. Knight is just so far forward on the Ahri. He is pushed up beyond belief, and Fofo is there, and Mako is there, and Knight's just like, well, I'm dead, and he just kind of gives himself up, and I totally understand why. There's no way you get out of that, but it is First Blood over to EDG. It's a nice gank. We get 2 for 2 at the Herald fight. It's like a 3v3, a 4v4 that kind of turns into, it ends up being a 2 for 2 for both sides, and, it's relatively even back and forth, but EDG is able to generate a small lead because they're able to get that Herald, they're able to use that Herald, and quite frankly, that First Blood did generate quite a bit of pressure in the mid lane for Fofo. But where things start going wrong for EDG is this play that JDG go for that is really aggro, and clearly EDG is just not expecting it. They go for a bot dive, in the bot lane. Obviously, there's nowhere else to go for a bot dive, but Jeje is actually just trying to clear his own jungle, and he walks into the entirety of JDG, who end up being able to take him out, and then JDG go for the bot dive. They're able to get the 2 for 0, so it ends up being a 3 for 0 in favor of JDG, and then all of a sudden, the gold lead is right back in favor of JDG. That really aggressive play that they go ahead and go for works out super in their favor, and really there was no looking back for JDG. Leave gets caught around 3rd Dragon, and JDG's able to win a big fight around there. Knight, at this point, is super far ahead. He's able to assassinate everybody in the game. He's got 25 stacks on Medjai's, and that is a scary Ahri. He's able to destroy everybody in a team fight. Eventually, they do get Baron and look to close the game. Missing makes a pretty interesting engage on Rakan. He ends up going down very early. JDG feel like they have to retreat, but EDG feel like they can take this fight. Now up a member, but unfortunately, they go just a little bit too deep. JDG's able to turn it. The Ahri just does too much damage, and JDG's able to close out the game, but really, really good one from JDG. Not really a lot of complaints outside of maybe some aggressive plays in the early game, but it was the aggressive plays that ended up pulling them back into this one after all. My player of the game is going to go to Knight. I know his only death was that First Blood in the mid lane, but outside of that, he played near perfect the entirety of this game. I mean, the Ahri is just doing so much damage. Nemera was on the cast, and I'm sure he was incredibly excited to see the 25 stacks on the Medjai's for Knight, and for him to be able to go out there and deal as much damage as he did. It was not really a competition. Knight played pretty flawlessly on this Ahri. Other players who played well, I thought Kanavi did did a really good job in the mid to late game. I thought 369 was super impactful on this Scion. I was very critical of him in their series against BLG because it just felt like he was worse than Bin in basically every game in that series. It's good to see him bounce back in a nice tank matchup here. Ruler and Missing were good outside of, Missing's weird engage towards the end of the game, but overall JDG just had a nice, comfortable one. Knight was kind of the big carry, but everybody put in their work in this one. As for EDG on the other side, definitely frustrating with the early lead that you got, but it certainly wasn't big enough for you to kind of rest on your laurels, which is kind of what it felt like EDG did. They just clearly were not expecting JDG to be fighting to get back into the game, and I don't really know why. I mean, JDG is one of the most aggressive teams in the LPL. I've talked about it all year. You should be knowing that they're going to try to do something, especially only down 1k gold with an RE that is slowly getting stronger. So JJ getting caught in his own jungle is pretty inexcusable. Leaving Mako eventually getting dove is frustrating from it, but from that point in the game, you've just got to be able to kind of push your advantage a bit more, and they just weren't doing that. It was kind of frustrating. That is kind of EDG. I compare them and Gen G a lot. I believe those two teams have kind of similar playstyles. I know a lot of people talk about Gen G being relatively slow. EDG is also a relatively slow team, specifically compared to a lot of their LPL counterparts, and I think it got taken advantage of in this one. But JJ is going to get my dud of the game. His late game engages on the Vi were disastrous. Him going in like way too deep towards the end of that game kind of cost them the game in the long run, and honestly his objective control just wasn't very good, even in the beginning of the game where it felt like EDG, really had the advantage. For them to be able to, basically every objective they got in the game was given to them for free. Not a lot of really good plays coming out from them, but I think you could give it to almost anybody. Leave was getting dove a ton this game and really wasn't accomplishing anything. Ale really had no pressure, was completely out macroed by the Scion, and then Lulu really wasn't going to be able to do much. Fofo was able to get ahead in the early game, but didn't really do anything with it. It just wasn't a good game from EDG in my opinion, specifically because they had that lead. The lead is good, obviously, to have, but you've got to do something with it, and it just felt like they sat back a little bit too much in this one for me. So moving on to game 2, I want to see them be more proactive. If they are going to be able to generate an early lead against JDG, that should be GG with how good they are in the mid to late game at team fighting. I need that mid game to be a little bit more active, a little bit more aggro, but for JDG, continue to push your advantages. This is a team that you can never count out because they are going to try and make the play that can salvage the game. Their mid game has been basically unstoppable by most teams in the LPL this split, and I do think that that's going to be a huge advantage for them in this series, but EDG is definitely going to need to win this game too if they want to stay alive in this series. Winning 3 in a row against JDG is not easy, and certainly is not something you want to bank your entire, MSI chances on. So a big game 2 here for both teams, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was JD Gaming. They are able to take game number 2, and they're able to go up in this series 2-0. My pick of JDG here is looking better by the minute. A lot of people were critical of JDG after their round 4 series against BLG, and obviously we've seen how good BLG can be, but turns out JDG was pretty good too for being able to win that one, and having faith in a team with these kinds of players I think is definitely paying dividends at the moment. They looked really, really good in game 1. Somehow they looked even better in game number 2. Let's go ahead and go over what ended up happening, but for the most part, I think I can summarize almost everything by just saying that JDG is ridiculously talented, and they can get over some mistakes that they can make in the mid-game, some positioning errors, maybe some over-aggression, just simply by outplaying their opponents, and it's very, very fun to watch. So let's go ahead and talk about it. This game starts pretty early. With Kanavi trying to make a play bot to get your Xayah Rakan ahead. You want to get them ahead in that lane as much as possible because Lucian Nami is going to have that power spike at one item. If you can accelerate the Xayah and Rakan, you can make that Lucian significantly less useful in the grand scheme of the game, and that's exactly what happened in this one. Ruler and Missing got pretty far ahead, and honestly, there really wasn't a lot that Leave and Mako could do to be able to make up for it. Kanavi ends up getting that first blood onto the Xayah. It ends up being a double kill in the bot lane, and then a 5-man dive bot lane to get another couple of kills, and by this point, the Xayah and the Rakan are just out of control. They are going to be a massive problem for basically the rest of the game, and that really did come true, but the mid game wasn't quite as clean from the side of JDG. Knight, in particular, had some bad positioning. I mean, he was caught out a lot. He ends up getting solo killed by Fofo. They do trade back the kill with Fofo having to overextend a ridiculous amount to get it in the first place, but, Knight caught out multiple times in this game, and I think he's lucky that the rest of his team was so far ahead and willing to kind of get him out of some of these precarious situations. His Syndra is, usually, notoriously, I would argue, world-class. He's probably the best Syndra in the world, or at least he has been over the course of the last few years, unfortunately, not exactly showing that off in game number 2, but it's fine. They were so far ahead at that point. The Xayah and Rakan were so big, and the Wukong was going to be such a problem that there really wasn't a lot that EDG could do to actually punish the Syndra. So they're heading into the mid game, you know, relatively behind in gold. There's really not a lot they can do. And then they just kind of really fumble the bag. JDG ends up going and taking Baron basically on spawn, and EDG just react like ridiculously slow. They're not there in time. The Baron ends up going basically for free, and then EDG ends up getting aced immediately after. It's a game-losing play, and I'm not exactly sure what they were doing. They had to know that JDG was going to be going towards it, but they just didn't react in time. Some very poor macro coming out from them. JDG is now super far ahead. They end up going into the base with Baron, trying to end the game, and they're able to do it. The team fight definitely goes the way of JDG, and the game is over very quickly. Player of the game for me is definitely going to be Ruler in the bot lane. They spent a lot of resources getting this Xayah ahead, and man, did she pay it off for him. A lot of the fights in the mid game, his positioning was really, really good. Not that he couldn't afford to be a little bit more aggressive, because as Xayah, with that ultimate, with the gold lead that they had, he could probably just melt through the entire team if he had just been AFK running it down. But I like the patience. I like the understanding that he doesn't need to create advantages for himself. He knows that he's got a Sion. He knows that he's got a Wukong. He knows that he has a Rakan. He knows he has opportunities to be able to get into a lot of these fights. And so really good stuff from him, and man, when he's on, he's just the best AD carry in the world, and it's not particularly close. I know a lot of people like to throw a lot of names out there. Gumayushi definitely deserves to be there. Viper, I think, deserves to be there. You know, a player like even Elk, you know, in the recent weeks, like, definitely deserves to be there, but Ruler is just on such a different level with what he's able to do at his absolute best. He's one of the greatest AD carries of all time, and he very consistently proves that to everybody in the world. But he wasn't alone in this game. Missing was also very good on the Rakan. They were able to do a lot as a tandem. The grand entrance in the early game was very, very big. The knockups are just huge onto something like Lucian Nami, especially if Lucian doesn't have dash. It's basically guaranteed at that point. And getting those two behind really destroyed EDG's plans of being able to survive the early game, because the Veigar needs time, the Viego needs time, the Jax needs time. There's really not a lot of things that you can do in the early game if this Lucian Nami is not a power point on the map for you, and that was clear to anybody who watched this game. But, you know, for as good as Ruler and Missing were, Kanavi was just as good. I mean, the dude was everywhere. I think Broadcast actually gave Player of the Game to Kanavi on this Wukong. His engages were phenomenal. His ability to create that lead for bot lane in the early game was fantastic. I think you're kind of discrediting Ruler and how he was able to play this game to not give him Player of the Game, but Kanavi was terrific, and he was a little bit of a question mark going into this series, and so really good to see him play that well. Knight did have his mishaps, you know. I think in a more even game situation, those Syndra misplays could have been a little bit costly for JDG, but lucky for them, it just wasn't going to be a problem with how the game ended up turning out, and I think outside of those mistakes, they were pretty much perfect this game. As for EDG on the other side, this has to be frustrating. You're now down 0-2 in a series to probably the most talented individual team in the entire world, and you've got to win 3 in a row to be able to secure yourself a spot in the finals. It's not looking good, and this game didn't look good. My dud of the game is pretty easily going to go to Leave on this Lucian. He was just way too aggro in the early game. He did not respect the 2v2 at all coming out from Xayah Rakan. I obviously know that his intention is to create an early advantage, to be able to kind of, you know, be a power point on the map, like I talked about for EDG, because you're that strong side. But the problem with that is you need to make sure that you have the ability to do that before you actually go and try and execute it. You need to make sure that you have the prio. You need to make sure that your jungler is there to support you, or alternatively, that the enemy jungler is not. It just felt like they were pushed up with no vision, and they ended up getting punished for it. Mako wasn't particularly good either, but Leave's positioning in particular was bad, in my opinion. Everybody else was fine. I think Fofo actually had a pretty good game on the Veigar. I think you could make a case in a neutral state that Fofo was actually better this game, but it didn't matter. They were so far behind. JJ getting resets on the Viego in the late game team fights, again, did not matter, and then Ale was just useless this game. It did not go long enough for the Jax to ever be relevant, and so unfortunate loss for EDG, but honestly, like, if they play like this again, they deserve to be down in lower bracket. This was a pretty miserable performance from a team that, you know, has struggled in the early game throughout the split. If JDG can continue to pressure that part of the game and put EDG on the back foot, it's not going to be an easy series, and we could be looking at a sweep, but EDG needs to win this to keep their upper bracket dreams alive. The series is not over until it is over, and EDG definitely have the opportunity to win a couple back here, but are they going to be able to, or is JDG going to close this out in a nice sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was JD Gaming. They are able to take game number 3. They're able to complete the 3-0 sweep of EDG, and they're able to book their ticket not only to LPL Finals, but to the Mid-Season Invitational in London. Really impressive stuff coming out from JD Gaming. They absolutely deserve this win. We talked about Game 1 being relatively in their favor. Game 2 definitely in their favor. Game 3 was a stomp. I mean, this was ridiculous. This was a 3K gold lead at 6 minutes into the game. This was a 10K gold lead at 17 minutes into the game. This was not close. Like, this was an utter destruction of EDG, and JDG, whoever doubted them, deserves to apologize, I should say, to this roster. I think that's the best way I can put it, because when they are at their best, they are arguably the single best team in the entire world, and I don't think it's all that close. Now, I talked about this in my preview. I thought EDG had a pretty poor matchup into a team like JDG anyways, who really excels in the mid-game. EDG wants to get to that team fight stage. They want to be able to kind of coast their way through the early game, and JDG's just not going to allow that to happen. I could not expect it to happen like this, though. The 3-0 sweep definitely took me a little bit off guard, but let's go ahead and talk about what happened. Huge fight at First Dragon at around 6 minutes that JDG just destroys. It's a 3-0. And it's all of a sudden a 3K gold lead. Like, instantaneously, they're already winning almost every single lane. And then they group as 5 as a unit to go down to that first dragon and just absolutely obliterate EDG, who's just trying to gain some semblance of control of the objective. You really should not have fought over it at all if you were Edward Gaming, but they wanted to do it, and they ended up paying the price for it. The game from that point on is going to be incredibly difficult to win. Not saying it's over at 6 minutes, but it kind of felt like it was over at 6 minutes. But, you know, what really kind of drove the dagger in was almost immediately after the Cassante solo killing the Scion. That's never a good sign. Your Scion getting solo killed by another tank is never a good thing, but 369 was phenomenal in this game. This won't be the last time that he solo kills Ale, or just someone in the game, if we're being entirely honest. I have written in my notes, literally everyone is winning. And I think that's the best way to describe how the early game ended up going for JDG. Literally everybody was winning. There is no negatives coming out here from JDG. Jeje goes top and dies to 369. Cassante under tower. They try to dive him, and I don't really understand why. He was already strong at this point. Your Scion and Vi, and the Scion was not particularly committed to diving the Cassante, and so Jeje just goes down. His game is completely over at that point as Vi, because now he's just going to ult in and immediately die. He's got 0 stats. He's got 0 pressure. There's nothing that he can do. He's got to rely on someone else. The only someone in this game with any semblance of gold is Fofo on the Akali, who was easily the best performing member of EDG in this series, but it's just not going to be enough. The bot lane was super outclassed in this series. We'll get to that when we get to the overarching, EDG talk, mostly kind of going over what I think might happen in the next series. EDG get obliterated in a fight at 15 minutes, and then I look up and I go, oh my god, it's a 9.5k gold lead at 15 minutes into the game. Like, it's doomed. It's just completely doomed. 369 goes on and solo kills Ale again, and, the game's just over. Like, there are a couple fights after this, a little chaotic, EDG's able to pick some stuff back, Fofo diving onto the backline, stuff like that, but for the most part, like, it's just decimation coming out from JDG, and it's a 25-minute game. I think it's the shortest game in the last few rounds of the playoffs in the LPL. I can't remember a shorter game than this, and man, did it deserve it. JDG played like absolute monsters, and they're moving on in this playoffs to the finals. And I saw it coming. Like, I hate to say it, but like, this is what I thought we were going to see. JDG is just one of those teams that when they're on, and, they're not going to be off forever. They were a little bit off against BLG. That usually does not happen 2 games in a row or 2 series in a row for JDG. And so, not entirely surprised to see this end up being how it turns out. We saw a lot of performances like this from JDG in the regular season, and obviously a lot of people predicted EDG because they have long-term memory loss, which is just kind of how it ends up being in the LoL fandom, especially the LPL, where, the split is so long that people just kind of forget what teams are like outside of like the last 2 weeks, and people are very much caught up in the narrative and in the momentum and in the what have you done for me lately kind of hype. I think a lot of that does kind of take over LoL fandom, and this is a good example of why you should probably take a look at what a team has done over the entire split and not just recently, because JDG was awesome all split long, and they were awesome again in this one. 369 is so clearly player of the game. I mean, the dude absolutely dominated on Cassante. He was everywhere. Every single play that involved him, he absolutely destroyed, whether it was a team fight, whether he was solo killing Leave in the back of a team fight, which is disgusting, solo killing Ale twice in a side lane, getting dove and just coming out on top in a 1-for-0. Like, nothing that he did this game was bad. Everything that he did this game was good. He was able to generate such a large lead for himself in the top lane, and quite frankly, destroy 2 members of EDG's games basically by himself. Sion was dead in the water, Vi was dead in the water, and there was just not a lot that EDG could do to end up getting back for that because the bot lane was also losing, and so very, very unfortunate, but 369 was awesome. People were doubting him going into the series, rightfully so. He was the one member that I was really concerned about on the side of JDG, but, you know, obviously he proved me wrong. He rolled all 9s today. We know he's been inconsistent, but when he's on, he's still one of, if not the best top laner in the entire world, like he was last year outside of maybe Zeus, right? And then Kanavi, another player who I think I've been pretty critical on over the course of 2023 compared to previous years. I did call him the best, or the second best jungler in the world last year, only behind Peanut. And I think he's still, you know, relatively up there in terms of scale. Now, did he necessarily show that all regular season? Maybe not, but maybe a lot of that was going to, you know, some of the more carry-oriented players, your Knights, your Rulers, maybe some of that, you know, potential that he was showing in the early game just ended up moving into a different direction. And you know what? If he's going to play like this every game, then it's definitely worth it. Missing was great. Ruler was amazing this series. He's awesome, and I'll get to him in a bit. Knight was a little bit shaky, had a very good game 1, but games 2 and 3 were probably not his best performances in the entire world. Either way, it still ended up going fine. He was so far ahead in lane that it didn't end up mattering, but JDG was just super dominant, and I'm excited to see them in finals. They deserve to be there, and they should be there. As for EDG, it's not an easy road now. You've got to go up against a BLG team that is definitely tough, and we'll cover that. We'll preview that, I should say, in just a minute, but let's kind of talk about this game and how everything just fell apart. You just got outclassed. Like, there really is no other way to say it. EDG has not really been tested like this all split long. Like, their players have kind of been able to play their style, and I do like a lot of their players, but some of them did crumble a little bit under the pressure. Ale ends up getting dead of the game in game 3, but the player that I really want to talk about having a pretty bad series, quite frankly, for EDG is actually Leave in the bot lane. I just felt like he wasn't very good here, and it does raise some questions. This is somebody who's never really been tested at a high level, and I like Leave a lot as a player. I mean, go back and watch my preseason rankings. I was already ridiculously high on him going into the split, but I mean, he crushed my expectations. He's the best rookie in the LPL, etc., but, you know, Ruler outclassed him, like, majorly in this series. And yes, it's Ruler, but you need to see Leave be able to step up and at least be able to survive the early 2v2s. Mako didn't exactly play great in this series, but Leave's positioning was very concerning, and his inability, I guess you could say, to survive against a really good bot lane does raise some question marks about what this team would be able to do hypothetically on an international stage, but nobody was really playing well. Jeje had a horrible series, Mako had a bad series, Ale had a bad series. Fofo was okay. He was definitely the best player on EDG here, but most of his gold in this game in particular was cleanup kills, not necessarily something worth celebrating, but overall, EDG's got some major question marks to answer for, but they don't have time to worry about that because they've got to go up against a really good Bilibili Gaming team that deserves their spot in top 3, as we've already talked about. They got to get their head back on straight, and they got to get locked in for that performance. But JDG now, moving on to MSI, moving on to finals, incredibly excited for them. Ruler is going to get my player of the series here in the upper bracket finals. He absolutely deserves it. He was sensational in the bot lane. Quite frankly, the better bot laner by a large margin in this series. That was the biggest lane that I could tell a massive difference in. Obviously, top lane was pretty noticeable as well, but Ruler and Missing were sensational in this series, and if they can keep that up, I mean, they're going to waltz their way to an LPL title. Ruler and Missing at their best are just unstoppable, as we kind of saw in this series, and the same can be said about a lot of other members of this team. When this team is clicking and doing the things that they like to do, they might be the single best team in the entire world. But that's going to go ahead and bring us to a preview of our semifinals matchup, our lower bracket finals matchup, which is a really intriguing one between the number 2 seeded Edward Gaming and the number 5 seeded Bilibili Gaming, going head to head, the winner punching their ticket to MSI and securing a spot to face JDG in the finals. It will be a rematch for one of them, both of them being sent down to lower bracket by JDG, BLG in round 4, EDG in round 5. And so it's definitely an intriguing matchup, but the first time we're seeing these two in a best of 5 all season long, so really, really intriguing matchup of two teams here. Let's go ahead and go lane by lane, kind of talking about some strengths and weaknesses. I don't want to go ridiculously in depth, but I do want to give you guys kind of a breakdown of where I think this series could go. Starting in the bot lane, because I do think that that is probably the most obvious place to start for both of these teams. Elk and On have been sensational, amazing over the course of the playoffs. Elk has pretty much cemented himself as a top 5 AD carry in the world at this point. The dude is ridiculous mechanically early and late in games. He just is the complete package. He knows when to be aggressive, but his positioning never gets to the point where you're like screaming at him. He's just a really, really good player, and On is somebody who enables that with his aggressive plays, his hook champions, the Nautilus, the Thresh, the Blitzcrank that come out. He likes to be this, facilitator, this playmaker in the bot lane, and I think it helps them a lot. But Leave and Mako were really good in the regular season. Don't let recency bias confuse you. This is a very good bot lane. Now, very different styles. Elk and On, while they are good in the late game, do like to try and make plays in the early game, and BLG definitely like to spend a lot of resources bot lane, but EDG not necessarily in that same boat. They like to spend a lot of their resources mid in particular, and Leave and Mako are often the recipients of more scaling-oriented picks. Now, they can pull out the Caitlyn, they can pull out, the Lucian. They've been able to do that throughout the year, but mostly it's Zarya Aphelios. That's what Leave is comfortable on. He wants to team fight, and that kind of goes to the overarching kind of narrative of EDG, which is team fight, macro, very Gen G style, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But if I had to give an advantage, I'm honestly, right now, going to give this to BLG. I think that they're at a higher level. I don't think it's a very big difference, because I think Elk is better than Leave, and I think Mako is better than On. And so, however you want to decipher that, I think ADC is just a tad bit more important right now in the current meta. So I'm going to give the slight edge to BLG, but two very good bot lanes going up against each other, and Elk is also in a little bit better form, I would say. And then Fofo versus Yagao. Talk about complete opposites. Fofo, a very resource-heavy mid laner. Yagao, a very resource-less mid laner. He's willing to give up resources, and that's why it's going to be so hard to compare them. I would say Fofo is definitely more likely to carry your team, but Yagao much more likely to have an impact on every single game, to be consistent across an entire series. And so, however you want to diagnose that, I think you go ahead. But the Jace has been massive for EDG. I don't expect it to get through a lot of pick bans. Same thing for something like the Gallia or the Talia on the side of BLG. These are things that are pretty commonly banned against each respective team. It's really just going to be about the rest of the team more than the mid laners. They're probably going to do their thing. Both of them have been pretty consistent over the course of the year. And then in the jungle, you've got JJ versus Xun. And this matchup in particular, to me, is very interesting, because in the regular season, I would have told you this was no contest, that JJ would absolutely throttle him. He was the best jungler in the league in the regular season, great at facilitating the rest of his team with the Maokai, with the Wukong, with the Vi, whatever he really needed to do, he could go out there and do it. But Xun has been in such phenomenal form in the playoffs, even outside of his comfort picks, which was always a little bit of a question mark. Outside of the Kindred, outside of the Nidalee, what is Xun going to be able to do against some of the best junglers in the league? Well, he's been picking up the Vi, and he's been picking up the Sejuani, and he's been succeeding on them really, really at a high level. And so, form right now, I'd give it to Xun, but, I would be lying if I said I didn't favor JJ in this matchup. He should be the better player, and he should be able to walk out with an advantage. And so, that really leaves us with our key matchup of the series, where I think a lot of things are going to be kind of decided, and that, for me, is going to be the top lane matchup. And crazy, the top lane matchup is going to be a big decider in the semifinals, but I really do believe it to be true. The LPL focuses on top lane a little bit more than almost any other region in the world, where it just feels kind of like a dead lane, and these two are just about as good as it gets in the top lane in the LPL. You can make a really solid case that these are the two best top laners in the LPL, maybe outside of 369, but two of the top three at the very worst, and I think we've seen that throughout the playoffs. But look at these two, Ale versus Bim. They both have their strengths and weaknesses. Ale is third in KP for all top laners. He's got a 57% KP as a top laner. That's absolutely absurd. He's first in gold per minute, fourth in damage per minute, fourth in KDA, and now the stats on the side of Bin aren't quite as, extravagant, but he's got a higher damage percentage. He's someone who is a little bit more invested in by his team, and that definitely shows up on tape as well. And he's still very high in gold. Second in gold per minute. He's fifth in KDA, seventh in damage per minute. The dude is still incredibly important towards the success of BLG. What these stats don't tell you is how important Bin has been specifically in this playoff run. He has completely transformed back into old Bin, and he's really become and shown that he still is one of the best top laners in the world. And so, if he can do that in the series against Ale, that's going to be massive. But if Ale is going to be able to be the version of him that he was in the regular season, and especially when these two played in the regular season, then I actually think BLG is going to suffer a lot. If Elk is the only person on the team who is reliably going to be able to, quote-unquote, carry for them, that's scary. Ben needs to be that strength in the top lane, and he's going to need to be able to win here. But if I had to give my prediction, and again, disclaimer, reminder, predictions are fickle. Just in general, they are predictions. They are guesses. They are opinions. I'm probably not going to get it entirely right, but another disclaimer, I've been great so far this year. It's actually been kind of insane. I went back and looked at, how accurate I've been. This has been one of my most accurate years of all time. And so, clearly I have at least a little bit of knowledge of what I'm talking about. But if I had to give a prediction in this series, I'm going to predict, maybe surprisingly, EDG. I know that's not necessarily the popular opinion right now. People think BLG are just on this too hot of a roll to be shut down, and a lot of people point to how close their series was with JDG, whereas EDG's was not, but I do think it's a little bit of a different story, right? Like, they're not the same team. BLG is the type of team, playstyle-wise, that can really fluster JDG. They can get under their skin because they're so good in the early game, but EDG is one of those teams that is going to punish mid and late game mistakes, and BLG, quite frankly, make a lot of mid and late game mistakes. I'm going to predict EDG in 5. My spread is EDG in 5, EDG 3-2, or BLG 3-2. I could see BLG winning it. I could see Elk popping off and Bin popping off and them just having a great series and the momentum carrying over, but I feel a little bit more confident in what EDG is able to do. Now, I could be entirely wrong about this. I don't feel like super gung-ho about it. That's why I'm giving, the 2-game spread like I always do. But in my opinion, I think EDG as a team matches up rather well into BLG if they can survive the early game. If they can't, well, then BLG is probably going to run away with this series. But overall, it should be entertaining. Obviously, these are two very fun teams and very fun organizations. I'm just incredibly excited to see them get on the Rift. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL Round 5 overview and analysis. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think, not only of the series that we covered here today, but also of the semifinals and potentially the finals, what you guys think is going to be happening down in the comment section below. Again, if you're interested in more content, I've got a ton of stuff. I don't only cover the LPL on this channel, I cover all 4 major regions as well as the NACL, and I've been covering playoffs, so you can go ahead and check out any of those playoff coverage videos on my channel. You can also hit that subscribe button. That's going to give you notifications for when those videos go live, and that really does, help me a lot. I really do appreciate that. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. Obviously, not only does it let me know that you guys are enjoying the video, but it helps get this out to more people, and, you guys have been awesome with that. You guys have really been a great core audience, I would say, to have. I really do hope you guys are enjoying the content I'm putting out, even if my voice is a little bit hoarse. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.